If you've seen any recent whiskey news, chances are you've seen headlines like this, or maybe you've seen headlines like this, or even headlines like this. And you might be wondering, what's going on? Why are whiskey distilleries not distilling? Well, I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd. This is whiskey, but today we're not reviewing whiskey, we're talking about whiskey. Specifically, we're going to be talking about why distilleries are pausing. We're going to be talking about what this means for smaller producers, and we're going to be talking about what it means for the future and for the consumer, which is you and me. Now, quick sidebar on tariffs and trade disputes between countries. At the time of filming this video, the tariffs between the United States and the European Union haven't yet gone into effect. They haven't even been designed yet, so I don't yet know what the impact or what the potential impact of those tariffs are, but we can still see distilleries are pausing. So today, just going to be focusing on the established news. I might do a video in a couple of weeks if those tariffs end up coming into force and seeing what the impact of them might be on the whiskey industry as a whole, but we can already see a bit of a slowdown. So today I'm just focusing on the original kind of slowdown, and if you want to see a video on those tariffs and the potential impact of those tariffs, leave me a note in the comments below and let me know you'd like to see that video, because I don't want to talk about politics, but when it's affecting the whiskey industry, I might just need to talk about it. So let's get back onto the main focus of the video, which is the pauses that we're seeing at distilleries. And first off, let me give a quick little sip of a nice little whiskey. Now I've got that out of the way, we can talk more about the pauses and specifically why the pauses. So everyone knows that the cost of living is going up, and that means consumer demand for whiskey, especially high-priced whiskey, is kind of going down because people have to focus on the main bills they have to pay. And at the same time, the cost of grains, the cost of power are going up, and two key ingredients for making whiskey are grains and power. So it's unsurprising that the cost of producing whiskey is going up. So if you are running a whiskey distillery, and you might say in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, we might see, let's say 90% of the demand that we're currently seeing. So you could say, all right, let's run our whiskey distillery the exact same amount that we would normally run in the year, but just let's make 10% less whiskey, which, is a viable strategy. Some distilleries will do it. Or you could say, let's take a 1 month pause. That'll take away about 8.5% or almost 10% of your annual production. But at the same time, you're not paying to run the stills. You're not wearing out the stills, which increases your maintenance budget. And you're probably able to use that month to give your employees some time off, if you're able to give them some time off, or you could do some maintenance on your distillery. You could do some construction. So there's a ways of reducing production in a way that makes sense. So for me, I think pausing, taking a 1 month pause is probably the best way for whiskey distilleries to cut costs effectively and still kind of meet their mainline demands in the future. Because like I just said, they are going to be focusing on the mainline. So if you run a whiskey distillery, chances are you use, let's say, 8 months of the year to make the stuff that is your standard mainline whiskey that will be enjoyed by most people. You might use 2 months for some really high-end stuff and some two months for the really high-end or experimental stuff. So if you're a whiskey distillery, you're not going to cut down on your mainline whiskey. You're not going to not see Jameson. You're not going to not see Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, Johnny Walker, Buffalo Trace. But you might see less of the Middleton Very Rares or the Johnny Walker Blue Label or maybe the Pappy Van Winkle. So they could take that 1 month pause and cut back on the more expensive or the ones that they see less demand from the consumers from, while still keeping their core whiskey on the shelf, still keeping it at roughly the same price. So I think that's kind of where the pause is going to be. It's not going to be cutting production of everything. It'll be reducing production of those more expensive and maybe less desired whiskies by the consumers who are facing the cost of living crisis, just the same as any distillery. Now let's get on to the distilleries I think will face a bit of trouble in the future, the smaller producers. And I'm going to divide these into 3 different kind of categories of small whiskey producers. We've got the ones that are always staying small, like your little boutique distilleries, your craft distilleries. We've got the distilleries that are trying to scale, trying to grow, and then we've got the others. They're not a distillery, but they are a bonder, a blender, a whiskey brand that relies on distilleries in order to function. So that first category, the small distilleries that are always going to stay small, I'd say they're going to face difficulties, definitely, but I'd say they're not going to have as much a difficulty as those middle category distilleries, because the smaller distilleries, they don't have a huge amount of stock in a warehouse that they have to pay insurance on, they have to pay a lot of staff costs on. It's the kind of idea of if you're looking at a thunderstorm ahead of you. If you're in a big cruise ship like a mainline distillery, like a Buffalo Trace or a Middleton, you can kind of go through the storm. If you're in a speedboat, you can turn around and repivot and go away from the storm. If you're in that middle class of boat, you might have a bit more trouble, because those small distilleries, they can say, okay, let's cut production a little bit, or let's focus on our gins or our vodkas. They can react a little bit more to the market, I think, than maybe those medium-sized producers. Now, don't get me wrong, it will still be a hard time for those boutique distilleries, but people will expect a craft distillery to cost a little bit more, so they might have kind of a fan base already that are willing to support them, willing to keep them going through the hard time, and then keep them going into the good times when the good times do come back. So I think the smallest distilleries will face hard times. Some of them might fail, but they're maybe in a better position to react than those bigger distilleries, the ones that are trying to scale, because those ones, they probably have warehouses full of whiskey that is aging. Maybe they, a couple of years ago, produced some really high-end, expensive whiskey. They put it into really expensive casks because they were thinking, we're going to be a luxury whiskey distillery. And if the cost of living crisis keeps going, people might not be in the mood for luxury whiskey. They might say, well, I don't have the money for that. So you might face a problem if you're in one of those distilleries where you've made a lot of really, really good stuff, but the demand just isn't there for it. And so those distilleries, I think, will face a lot of trouble, depending on how much stock they've got that can be sold kind of at a normal price to keep the customer demand going, and how much their investors might want their money back. Because if the investors are feeling the pinch, they might also say, well, let's pull that money back out of the distillery, let's get our return before things are too late. So it depends, but I think those distilleries are going to face the pinch the hardest. And then we've got the third category of brands. That's the bonders, the blenders, the bottlers, the people who buy whiskey from another company and then rebottle it, recask it, blend it in an interesting way, do something to make it a bit different. They, I think, will be fine initially, and then they'll probably face like a second round effect, where if all the whiskey they got on the shelves right now, they've bought it for a purpose, they know what they're doing with it, great. But then if they try and buy more whiskey in the next couple of years, it depends on if those pauses at the big distilleries have meant they don't have any extra whiskey to sell, or if some of those medium-sized distilleries have had to sell off their whiskey at cheaper prices than they would have expected to. So those kind of the third round, the bonders, the blenders, the bottlers, they probably are in a bit of a limbo pattern, a bit of a holding pattern, wondering what's going to happen in the next couple of years and what it'll mean for them. So I think they're in a bit of a wait and see pattern, which is a bit of a pain, especially if you're trying to grow a brand like a lot of those brands are. And I think that leaves us as the consumers, I don't want to say it, but leaves us also in a bit of a holding pattern, because we don't know what the future is going to bring. Like I mentioned, those tariffs, like they could come in, they might not come in. Either way, it means there's a bit of uncertainty in the future. It means that we don't know exactly what's going to happen, how much the cost of living is going to keep on going up, how much the cost of energy is going to keep on going up. And it means that we're in a bit of a, not a difficult situation, but a bit of an uncertain situation. And I don't think anyone ever wants to be in that kind of uncertain situation. It might mean that some of our favorite brands close down, or maybe they stop producing entirely and they switch over to a different kind of product, which means maybe if you're the kind of person who likes collecting old whiskies, it might be good for you. You might be able to get what's called a silent distillery collection, where you have whiskies that can no longer be bought because the distillery has closed. But me personally, I would much rather have that distillery open than have a collection of rare and expensive whiskies, because I'm not the kind of person who buys whiskies to try and sell it later on. I'm the kind of person who buys whiskies to enjoy it right here and right now. It also probably means that we're going to see a little bit less innovation in the next few years, because if brands are pausing their production and they're saying, let's just stick to the core, let's stick to the old reliable, let's stick to what's going to get us money coming in the door while we're going through this rough patch, chances are we're not going to see distilleries really pushing the boat out and really experimenting with something that might end up not being sellable, that might not be desired by consumers, that would just be wasted money. So we're probably going to see a bit of less kind of innovation, a bit of less brand kind of engagement, less like that kind of innovation that we'd like to see in distilleries. But that's just me. I mean, what do you think? Like I said, I think we're in a bit of an uncertain position where we don't know what's going to happen over the next 2, 3, 4 years. We don't know where this cost of living crisis is going to go. We don't know what's going to happen with international trade. So for me, I think distilleries are in a bit of holding pattern. But if you have any thoughts or ideas about where this whole whiskey industry is going to go, I'd love to hear from you. So make sure you drop a line in the comments below, because I always make sure to read all the comments. Me, I'm going to keep on enjoying a nice little whiskey. Hope for the best, and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.